And welcome back to the show. Well, despite several lockdowns across the nation and fewer people were on the roads, the number of actual traffic deaths has increased. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, out of over 38,000 people who were killed in crashes last year, over 7,000 were African American. Our next guest shares a little bit about this. States, locals, and federal governments, how they can work together to improve these roadways to reduce the number of fatalities amongst Black drivers. Joining us now is the partner, Levine Slavit PLLC, Ira Slavit. And Ira, good to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here, Don.
When I look at those statistics, definitely very challenging and very harrowing statistics. 38,000 people with traffic safety, were killed in crashes. But then we look at African Americans and we see this high number. What is the correlation here?
You know, I read that there's a saying, I don't know if it really is or not, that when America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu. And it seems like to some extent that's what's happening with these traffic fatalities. A study done by the Governor's Highway Safety Association discovered Blacks are killed consistently higher rates than whites, and that doubles when it comes to pedestrians. Then there's another report by Smart Growth America, which is a DC-based urban development advocacy group, found that Black pedestrians from 2010 to 2019 were 82%, that's 82% more likely than whites to be hit by drivers. And yet another study by the University of Nevada discovered that drivers are less likely to slow down for Black pedestrians. And there seem to be a number of different reasons that might explain that, different factors. One is that during COVID, more minority and Black workers had to actually go to their job. They could not work from home. And so that put them more at risk. Also, many families could not afford a car or grocery delivery, other conveniences, so they would have to go out and again make themselves a little more vulnerable. Also, the workers that did have to go to work often were paid hourly wages, so they would have real incentive to get there on time, which might not have led to the best safety choices. One other factor that's been really attributed to this phenomenon is the fact that just the infrastructure of roads and infrastructure in minority neighborhoods is just not as good as elsewhere. One of the reasons seems to be that during the construction of the interstate highway system and for other reasons, a lot of communities were displaced or cut off from other communities, the actually infrastructure bill that the Senate just passed, the US Senate, actually tries to address some of that. They've allocated $10 billion to reconnect communities. So hopefully that'll survive the legislative process.
Yeah, let me delve a little bit further into that, because when you talk about minority communities and communities of color, oftentimes you will hear that people within these communities are making phone calls downtown to public officials, City Hall, really trying to get their streets maintained. And when you look at, whether it's snow removal or basic construction needs, it seems as though minority communities always come up with the short end of the stick.
Well, the statistics show that this year, 2021, the first 6 months of this year had the most fatalities in terms of motor vehicle crashes. It's the deadliest first half of any year under Mayor Bill de Blasio's administration. So rather than these calls maybe helping things, things are getting worse. Hopefully, things will be done to address that. As far as there is some state legislation designed, working its way through, it's called the Crash Victims' Rights and Safety Act. It's actually 8 bills combined that address certain things that give accident victims some rights that are similar somewhat to the Crime Victims' Rights Act, so they can have better access to information. It might lower the minimum blood alcohol level, might give municipalities the ability to lower the speed limit even more than they have now. And that's one thing that I think the de Blasio administration should get some credit for, is they did lower the speed limit from 30 to 25 miles an hour in the city. Some people, I'm sure, found that inconvenient, but it does reduce the number of accidents and also the severity of accidents.
And when we talk about that, accidents as a whole, a lot of people are involved in accidents, and some for the very first time. Some end up in fatalities, but the majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people, end up in minor fender benders to, serious fender benders. Walk us through an accident. If an individual is involved in an accident, sometimes people don't know their rights and what they should do. So let's take it from the perspective that, hey, I'm involved in a car accident with another vehicle. Thank God it's not so serious, but it is serious enough that there's damage involved to both vehicles. What should I do, particularly when I know that I'm in the right?
Well, thank you, Daren. And as you say, the safety and health is the most important thing. And so the first thing you should do is make sure that you and the occupants of your vehicle are okay. A lot of what goes on at accident scenes that will help people later. One thing is police report will help, because it will change other people from changing their stories, especially in the situation as you gave, Daren, where you know that you're in the right. Sometimes people are not always, later on, they have a chance to recreate a little bit what happened. But an important thing is to preserve as much information and get as much information as you can at the accident scene. So that could involve taking photographs of both your vehicle and the other vehicle, not necessarily details of the damage, but more overall shots. Even parts of vehicles that are not damaged, take photos of that, because you don't want somebody to have another accident and say that later and say that came from your accident. Photographs are useful. Make sure you get the information from the other party. License, registration. Don't let somebody tell you they're in a hurry. We had a situation, somebody was in an accident. The other driver said, I'm an Uber driver, I've got a passenger, he's got to get to the airport, or whatever the excuse was, and drove off, and it was a huge problem. So those are really the primary things. Also, be careful what you say to anybody at the scene of accident, especially somebody who you don't know. These days in New York, it's legal to record a conversation as long as one person consents. So if you're doing the recording, you can be that one person who consents. So you want to be careful not to say something that might get used against you later.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about attorneys, because you have to get an attorney involved, especially when there's accidents and a victim, or you're really just trying to seek damages, because we do understand negotiating with insurance companies are not always the easiest thing. So for a person who may not necessarily have an attorney or challenged in affording being able to afford an attorney, what are the options?
Well, you're right, Daren. You do have to be very careful in your conversations with insurance companies, even your own insurance company, because it may come about that the other vehicle doesn't have insurance, and your remedy is against your own insurance company. And you have to be careful not to give any kind of recorded statement that might be used against you. As far as hiring an attorney, most attorneys that handle these types of cases will take the case on a contingent percentage fee basis, so that you will only owe the attorney a fee based on the amount of recovery that they get for you. So there are different ways to find an attorney. You can do it online. Also, many of the bar associations, whether it's a county bar association or a city bar or a state bar, they have a lawyer referral services that lawyers can register for, and you might want to contact them for a recommendation instead of relying on what's on the internet. But time can be of the essence as far as contacting an attorney, because there are time limits to file, whether it's a claim for no fault for your own medical benefits, or claims against the responsible other vehicle, or possibly there's a problem with the road design or an infrastructure problem. You have to file something or serve a governmental entity. It's a real problem. Some of those deadlines are 30 days for no fault, or 90 days for the governments.
Yeah. We hear a lot of times this painful story. you're a person that's involved in an accident, it's the other person's fault, but then you find out the other person has no insurance. What happens for that person that is the innocent party in this? Do they actually get left with footing the bill and going back and forth with their insurance company?
That's an excellent question. So two things. One is I referred to no fault benefits. That's a benefit that covers, or those benefits cover your out-of-pocket expenses like for hospital, ambulance, doctors, loss of earnings. That comes from your own insurance company, and that's mandatory that you have that coverage. There's another part of your insurance policy called the supplementary uninsured motorist coverage, and that comes into play in exactly the situation that you described, Daren, where the other vehicle doesn't have insurance, or maybe doesn't have as much insurance as you do. And then that is also mandatory, at least in terms of a $25,000 limit per person and $50,000 total per accident. That's required in every insurance policy. So if the other vehicle doesn't have coverage, you file a claim with your own insurance company for that.
Yeah.
And just one piece of advice for people, because you can have, let's say, $100,000 of liability coverage, which protects your assets if you're negligent. But if somebody else is negligent, it's the amount of insurance coverage that you have under the supplementary uninsured coverage that matters. So you should try to maximize your supplementary uninsured coverage. And those premiums are significantly less than for liability coverage.
Yeah. Types of compensation. When you talk about receiving money from an accident, a lot of people say, well, it's a flat out one-way thing, but there are different types of compensation that an individual can receive. Can you share with us a little bit about the types of compensation that an individual can get when involved in an accident?
In New York, we have a system of compensatory damages. So you can recover not as a punishment for the other driver's conduct, but to compensate you for the loss, the injuries, the loss of income beyond no fault that you've sustained. So that involves bringing a lawsuit against the other vehicle, the owner or the driver. With respect, and that's in terms of injuries, with respect to wrongful death, or if someone is killed in an accident, New York State provides that there is, in addition to the conscious pain and suffering of the person who was killed, there is a recovery for the financial loss to the estate. Now that the estate meaning the next of kin in the family. Now that actually in New York is another issue that involves inequality, because being limited to the financial loss as opposed to the emotional grief of losing a loved one, that works to the disadvantage of someone who maybe is a homemaker, doesn't earn wages, or their wages aren't that significant, or they're elderly and they're retired. And so that is an unfair situation in New York. There is something, legislation pending called in New York, the Grieving Families Act, which I actually, last time I was on, I misspoke. I thought it had been passed and was awaiting a decision by the governor whether to sign it, but actually, and I apologize for that, that law passed in the judiciary committees in both the Assembly and the New York State Senate. But that's, I think, as far as they got. And those, you talk about calls to legislators to fix the roads. That might be something that the communities might be interested in getting in touch with their legislatures and rectifying that. New York is in the minority of states in this country that do not allow the families to recover for their emotional grief for the loss of a loved one.
Pretty challenging there. When you talk about no fault, it's something that we know here in New York. Many people outside of New York may not necessarily be so familiar with no fault. Talk about no fault for a moment and how that actually applies.
No fault insurance, which you may see in your declarations page on the insurance policy, is called personal injury protection, or PIP. That provides your economic loss, or compensation for your economic loss. And that's something you have a 30-day time limit to apply for to the insurance company, and you do not have to prove anybody was at fault. Basically, that's part of the system. Is even if it's your fault, even if the accident is 100% your fault, unless you're driving drunk or recklessly or some other things, or on a motorcycle, you can get your medical bills and some lost earnings paid without having to prove fault. It's just as long as it's related to the motor vehicle accident, you will get no fault coverage. And that could apply, that also would apply if you're a pedestrian. It would be the vehicle that hit you usually that provides no fault coverage. And if I could just go back for 1 second, that uninsured situation also applies not only if you have a car, but you're a pedestrian and you're hit by another car that's negligent, your own policy might come into play and give you extra benefits, even though your vehicle was not involved in the accident. And that could also apply to members of your household and family.
Yeah. Before we go, I just want to get an opportunity to hear from you about some common trends that you're finding, particularly when it comes to accidents and those, particularly in communities of color.
Well, the trends that I see are really not that different than what's reported. There's just there's some more traffic back out now. There was a point where the phones were kind of quiet. This goes back to the beginning of the pandemic, but now people are out and about, and we're finding that people are again being exposed to the risks of being pedestrians, and we're here to try to help them as best we can.
Yeah. Ira, thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum. Some much needed information when it comes to regards to accidents and what a person needs to know. Unfortunately, it's only when a person gets in the actual situation that they actually now have to work it out. And many times people are so unprepared, but thank you for giving us some well-needed information and some well-needed tips. Thanks much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
All righty. Well, Ira Slavit here with us on the Social Justice Forums. Want you to stay with us. We've got more show coming up in a few.